This past year, the Biden administration's greatest legislative achievement was quite probably the Build Back Better program. Through the Build Back Better program, the Biden administration passed a $1 trillion effort to revive the economy. The interesting thing about it was that they accomplished it by essentially redefining what we mean by critical infrastructure from the normal definition that we'll talk about here in a second to include all things labor. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sean Williams, and I am the director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy, as well as being the professor of political science here at Campbellsville University. We're here today to talk about this question of critical infrastructure, and specifically to examine whether infrastructure would best be left up to the private sector, or whether or not there is a role for the public sector in either establishing or defending the infrastructure that we have. I'm joined today by four of our absolutely brilliant panelists, veterans to this show, all as they appear on my screen from top to bottom. We have Carly O'Neill. Good morning, Ms. O'Neill. We have Kylie Crawley, Zachary Budd, and Savannah Reed. How are all of y'all today?
Good morning. Good. How are you?
Doing fantastic. So let's just jump into this. As I said in the opening, the Biden administration, they rolled out this massive plan, this massive spending program. It was essentially voted on by party line vote. And in the plan, what they essentially tried to do was establish or define what critical infrastructure was, and then spend a whole bunch of money on all of these things that they considered to be infrastructure. So let's start off, first of all, I guess, there. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean by critical infrastructure, and a little bit about what sectors of the economy can fall under this infrastructure heading. So Kylie, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Okay, yeah. So critical infrastructure, it's basically any system that's vital to the U.S. and without that system, an aspect or even multiple aspects of the United States society will suffer. I have a quote, actually. The nation's critical infrastructure provides the essential services that underpin American society. And that's from the Office of the Press Secretary in 2013. There's like several different, there's three recognized categories of critical infrastructure, which are physical, cyber, and human. And there's obviously different critical infrastructure categories that go under those categories, or sectors, I guess would be a better word for that. And then some of the sectors of the economy that they fall under is basically all of them. So the energy sector, food and agriculture sector, and the communication sector all have a very fundamental role in the United States economy.
So, okay, when you talk about you have physical, cyber, and human, and you list off all of those infrastructures, it sounds like if you define it that way, it's not just some sectors, like it's literally the entire economy. Mr. Budd, is that accurate? Like, do both political parties or do both ideological poles in the American spectrum, would they define critical infrastructure the same way, or is there a difference of opinion between, say, Republicans and Democrats about how we should think about critical infrastructure?
I think that they would define it in about the same way, but their reactions to, how they would progress about different laws and different ways that they think about it is different. So, for example, I think for Democrats, they are more worried about conservation and just trying to make things about the best they could for everybody, for the most part. Conservation of energy and just trying to make preparedness and preparedness to natural disasters, cyber attacks, things just more readily available. The Biden administration also came out with a security brief earlier this month, and the whole first 2-3 paragraphs talking about just making sure that everyday Americans will be prepared for things to happen, for energy grids to continue to be safer, to be more energy prevalent, for different ways of energy to be created that's not necessarily non-renewable, things like that. I think more Democrats are generally concerned about that. While as Republicans, I feel like I'm more just trying to figure out what's the best for the economy in general. So I know in Kentucky, especially, there's a lot of supporters for the coal mining, and in general, just different ways that we can, continue to do how we're doing now. The conservative route, just things we've done for, 50, 100 years, versus trying to figure out different ways to preserve and protect the stuff now and upgrade it. And instead, I feel like they're trying to just make sure that we can continue to do the things that we've been doing for 50, 100 years, while also trying to make sure that it's in the best way for the economy for everybody as well. Not really caring about the future as much as Democrats propose that they are.
Yeah, focusing in on that question of conservation, the difference between infrastructure as simply being the cheapest source of energy as opposed to renewable sources of energy. Do you guys have an opinion or any insights as to which approach is better? The Democratic approach, which is to have a more decentralized power grid with energy being produced using wind and solar literally everywhere, or I guess the more conservative approach, the idea that energy should be kind of centrally produced using the cheapest means possible. Do you think that conservation should be a focus of infrastructure?
I would say that it is important, because if you think, if we go back to the definition of critical infrastructure, you're thinking of the things that the United States would not be able to thrive on without those critical infrastructures. So I would consider energy to definitely be one. Now, depending on where you go with which way you go with energy, whether you take the more conservative route or if you try to use more solar and wind and all of that, that just depends on what would make the United States the most money. Mainly because since critical infrastructure is so political, it's also political because of its economic structure. And because you could do one with less money, and you could do the other with no money. It depends on which one is going to be the most reliable, maybe, is what I would argue.
Mm-hmm. That actually is the reliability question is an interesting point. On the one hand, we know that coal and oil are subject to price fluctuations on the international market. At the same time, we also know that solar and wind are depending upon, having a cloudy day and the wind blowing. So the reliability question, I guess, is an important one. So the part of the purpose of our conversation today is to talk about whether or not these critical infrastructure questions should primarily be left up to the private sector, that basically capitalism and the normal operations of the economy can fix all this for us, or that they should be left up to the public sector. Would one of you guys kind of explain to us, to the listeners, what is the difference between private sector or public sector? What exactly does that mean? What exactly are we talking about?
Really, the main difference between the private and the public sectors is that the private sector are ran by privately owned companies. We can see the same thing when it comes to defense contracting companies. And then the public sector is ran by the government and other sections of the government. So you have actually 16 sectors of critical infrastructure under the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And within each of these 16 sectors in that agency, a different part of the government is responsible for each sector. So you got Homeland Security, who may be responsible for some. You have the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're responsible for some. So you just have different governmental agencies that are responsible for that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, I also have another difference between the public and private. I found this in my research. It's kind of interesting to see. I didn't really understand what the difference was until I did some more research. I have a quote: pure government provision of infrastructure often involves a shorter-term project outlook that in some cases can be detrimental to the quality of the project delivered. So basically they're saying that government provision of infrastructure is shorter term, so it's often cheaper But then because it's cheaper and shorter term, the quality of the infrastructure is much less than private ownership of infrastructure. So then it goes on to say, while governments may take a long-term view of a project with regard to social benefits that may be offset by the short-term concerns of government officials, such as re-election or the use of funds for more popular purchases, such as tax cuts, which can push policymakers towards cost minimization and as a result, diminishment of the quality of the project delivered and an increase in longer-term maintenance and operation costs. So basically, it kind of just like that article really talks about like the pros and cons of private versus government-owned, public-owned infrastructure and how citizens are involved in private and public infrastructure. So in public infrastructure, citizens pay for it through taxes. So that would include like transportation, how maybe they'd use our tax money to build a new road, new highway, or like building schools, like that's public infrastructure. Whereas private infrastructure is more like sometimes healthcare, food and agriculture, commercial facilities, and critical manufacturing. Oh, and as well as energy, depending on how you perceive energy. If you're paying for an electric bill to where you're getting your energy turned on and it's run by whatever, that would obviously be different than if you have solar panels on your roof. But
also, too, like 85% of, according to the Department of Homeland Security, the 85% of the public-private sector split is 85% of it is private sector around that. And during my research as well, I found out that they do the public-private sector split because they kind of have to the government and these private entities have to kind of have a relationship in order to be able to provide for our citizens efficiently. So the government doesn't, as wide and vast as they are, you have to think about the local state governments as well. They don't have the necessary resources to respond or prepare, prevent for different situations as maybe a private entity would. So the government works in, allocating, works on being able to allocate the different resources to where they need to be in general, while the private entities, provide the resources, provide the people to be able to do the things that they need to do in order to make the specific place a better place for citizens, since the government doesn't have the necessary time, resources, allocations for, the vast variety of specific areas and places that they need to get to for whatever issue or prevention measure is going on.
So then I'm going to ask you to jump in here for a second. So when we're talking about this idea of a private sector or semi-private sector involvement in critical infrastructure, I mean, I would assume that businesses would only get involved in critical infrastructure if they could be profitable. You're not going to invest I'm not going to invest my own money, or a business not going to invest their own money unless they think that they're going to be able to get a profit back. Are there some situations where infrastructure is more profitable, or are there situations where I could actually, I guess, if 85% of infrastructure is private, there's got to be some. When is it more likely to be profitable for a business?
I think it's more likely to be profitable for a business if they can actually benefit from it. Like, for example, if a factory wants to make it easier for their workers to get to the factory, like they might build a bridge or something like that. And I think that it's not really like the public sector would invest in infrastructure if it's going to severely hurt their economy too. So they're also not going to invest in it unless they can benefit from it as well, the same way that the private infrastructure investments would do.
yeah, I agree with Savannah. Private funders, I guess I'll call them, they usually only are involved in critical infrastructure if it benefits them. So many times it's like commercial, to where if they can use something to market their product better, or manufacture their product easier or cheaper, stuff like that. They'll use, and like she said, getting to the factory easier, like stuff like that usually benefits businesses. But it also, I read something that says that the private sector of critical infrastructure encourages like developing partnerships and sharing knowledge, technology, and transferring skills. And they also have the potential to kickstart development, enable productivity gains, generate better quality jobs, strengthen skills, and promote technological advances. And that's by Pavone et al. But anyway, all of like those things come from investment in critical infrastructure. It does a lot more things for businesses than just make one thing easier. It has like a wide variety of like benefits for them, and that's usually when private actors get involved in stuff like that.
I agree with
Fairly.
Kylie. Oh, sorry.
You're good, Carly.
I agree with Kylie. According to the Department of Commerce, critical infrastructure is projected to grow by over $53 million in the next 10 years, or now in the next 8 years. And so it would be a lot more beneficial at this time to private companies to get involved in the process, because it's going to have such a huge growth amount that they would be making more money getting involved.
I mean, the way that you're describing it, so for example, with the specific example that Kylie was giving, I mean, it seemed like you'd have a lot more private sector efforts to provide education. Although I guess by that definition, I suppose private universities would be private providers of critical infrastructure, right? Or am I thinking about that incorrectly?
I think it depends on what level of education you consider to be critical infrastructure.
Okay, what do you mean?
Because many people would consider it to be critical infrastructure that you go through K through 12. College might not be considered critical infrastructure. I guess for us, it was, being seniors and ready to get out of here. It was critical for us to come here, but I don't know that, going back to the definition, I don't know that anything would be detrimental if there was no college. I think there would definitely be an effect like seen in the United States societies, but I don't think that it would be detrimental enough to affect one or more aspects of the of society. So I don't think that college would come to the definition, or even past college, master's, PhD programs, stuff like that. I don't think that would be considered critical infrastructure under the definition, but I guess it depends on how you look at it. It'd be different for everyone. But.
And I have a different definition that was provided by the Clinton administration in 1996 after Bill Clinton established the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, which was just a little bit before the disaster that was 9/11, which had a lot of acclaims for. Sorry, I just hit my foot on my electrical thing. I have it saying the industries, institutions, and distribution networks and systems that provide a continual flow of the goods and services essential to a country's defense and economic security and to the health, welfare, and safety of its citizens. So I would, by that definition specifically, and thinking about how Kylie's definition, how she had hers, is I don't think that really education would fall under it as much, and if it was, it had to be like very minimal, because if education does provide goods and services to a country's defense, economy, security, because it helps promote different pathways to different jobs to get that elevate that eventually elevate those specific qualities that are in this definition. But I don't think it inherently directly impacts the defense, economy, security, or the health and welfare of its citizens, provide just having them be a little bit more educational. I think there's parts of the U.S. that are just fine, that people they don't fully finish high school or they don't do college, and I think there's they can have positions in the economy and in the defense of the system that don't require a full education as well. So I don't think that necessarily the education would be considered more or less private than anything else, personally.
I mean, it's interesting the way that y'all are kind of explaining this with education, and I'm wondering if you can take this argument that you're making and applying it to other sectors of the economy. So you seem to be suggesting that the less critical the critical infrastructure, the more likely it is to be provided by the government. So if K through 12 education is more critical, that's government provided too. But then the less critical it gets, whenever I get to higher education, then that's when the private sector is stepping in. So, or do I have that backwards? I guess maybe I'm confused. So the more critical it is, K through 12, the more likely you are to have public education. The less critical it is, the more likely you are to have the private sector step in. Maybe that's your argument. Did I get it right that time?
I don't know that I would disagree. Like, I agree, but Zach?
I think it kind of just depends on what specific things the government would rather have a potential hold on rather than leave to the private sector. Because for education purposes, the government definitely wants to have a hold on that. They have a whole regulatory agency of Department of Education. They have different appointees. They have a whole system that they have promoted for that, and for it's not really business oriented. Like, they don't get as there is not a large potential of money that can be held from it because it is specifically government oriented. That is, the government is supposed to provide for the people, protect the people, do all that kind of stuff. So I think that while I agree that you're correct that the less critical sectors or the less critical infrastructure is more provided by private, I think it's very dependable on what the government specifically wants to provide for their people versus rather than work with different agencies, work with different departments to provide for specific, different kinds of infrastructure. I think it's very gray area kind of deal.
Maybe we can make this more tangible. Something that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Kylie, was that whenever I have a short-term project, that's when the government is, or maybe is whenever the government is involved, they're more likely to think in the short term. And then there's also this argument that the things that are super critical are the ones that the government is most likely to get involved in. So can you give me some examples of something where the government thinks, hey, this is super, super critical. This is something that we absolutely have to have. The public sector is absolutely going to provide this, but because they're providing it, maybe it doesn't last as long or work as well as we might want it to. Can we think of anything that's practical that the viewer could latch onto?
Yeah. So going back to what Zach said, I think critical infrastructure, this is not necessarily answering your question, but I promise I'll get there. Critical infrastructure, I think education is 100% critical infrastructure. I would never argue that. It's very important that people go through K through 12 because I promise I deal with uneducated, stupid people every day. And it's difficult. So if the whole world was like that, I know the United States society would suffer. We wouldn't have higher class and lower class because you don't have people that are higher class and lower class citizens. You don't have people that are educated, or difference in education, difference in people, difference in background. You don't have that if everybody didn't go to school. So I would definitely argue that education is critical infrastructure. However, back to what you said with the getting back to the critical infrastructure with the public sector, I do think that the government is more likely to fund critical infrastructure if it is very critical. With that being said, critical infrastructure is more schools are critical, but private school, not critical. And that would be privately funded, but that's because that's supposed to be an elite school. That's not necessarily critical infrastructure. I can see the benefit to it, and I can see the benefit to the economic gains of that. And therefore, I would consider it to be critical infrastructure because of the economic aspect of it. However, I don't feel like it affects multiple aspects of critical infrastructure. So I would still argue that public sector infrastructure is most likely to be more critical than private sector infrastructure. Even if private sector infrastructure is 85% of the critical infrastructure. Let's go back. What was the question?
I remember so whenever I teach the public admin class, I haven't taught it in a little bit and may never teach it again. There's this fascinating article. I think it's fascinating. Maybe students disagree. But it tries to answer the question, why did New Orleans flood after Katrina? Right. So we have a hurricane, Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane hits New Orleans. Everyone knows that New Orleans is eventually going to get hit by a Cat 4 hurricane. It is entirely expected. And yet when it does, the city is completely, underwater and it's destroyed, and literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are displaced. And so the question is, why did it happen? And what it ultimately, the argument that the article makes is there's absolutely no money for an individual or a business to build levees. And at the same time, anytime the government is trying to decide, how do I allocate my budget, it would always rather allocate the budget on short-term tax revenues rather than on trying to deal with a hurricane that's going to happen once every 100 years. Right. And so whenever I think about why would a business build a levee to protect farmland whenever I'm protecting literally millions of acres of farmland and I don't own any of it? But individual farmers can't possibly do it. Why would a business build a highway from Campbellsville, Kentucky to Louisville? Why would Amazon just not instead build their plant or their storage facility in Louisville rather than trying to figure out how to get vehicles to there? And so I think that's part of my question is when we look at public sector, why would businesses invest in rural America? Why wouldn't they just place all of their investment in urban centers? What's the advantage of trying to build a factory in Campbellsville if I have to transport all the goods and take care of all the highways myself? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that private sectors are more likely to immediately invest in critical infrastructure if it has an immediate economic gain. So for instance, like you said, taking care of rural areas to where you have to transport packages and stuff like that. If you build a facility in Campbellsville rather than building it in E-Town or Louisville, the difference there is if you can publicly, if you can get people to have more jobs, if you're creating this so you can get more jobs, you have a higher political respect for yourself as a business. However, other side to that, if you can make money, that's the first goal for all businesses. Whereas for the public sector, it's re-election, but for a private sector, it's to make money. I feel like that's a given. Anything that you could do to immediately see economic gain is what the private sector wants to invest in.
I agree with that too, because I was thinking about it as both of you guys were talking, is the private sector probably doesn't want to invest into anything without an immediate benefit as well. If it's monetary, I was thinking that if for the highway example, Amazon probably wouldn't help out with the highway unless they got a tax cut or they got, just something revenue wise that would benefit them more than, just saying, hey, thanks for doing this. You helped out a lot of people. And I think that the private sector is also influenced a little bit to help in the public sector when the public sector asks, because the public sector provides a lot of amenities that the private sector can't necessarily do. One of the big things that I found it was everywhere, all of my sources and all of my resources, except for Bill Clinton's 1996 thing, because that's a little bit before time, was the part of cyber attacks, and the government can provide defense, provide training, necessary people, personnel for against these cyber attacks, whereas businesses, private sectors can't as well as they would like to. So I think that that's one of the benefits that maybe the relationship between the public and private sector provides, is that that defense that the government's supposed to have for all the citizens, all the private sectors. So I think that private sectors would be more influenced to be able to help out or be able to support monetarily or just help support monetarily these structures of building dams, of building levees, of building protection sources for tornado houses, things like that. If there's more of a suggestion that their relationship with the government would be hurt if they didn't, because the government provides the defenses that they personally cannot, or other benefits that they personally can't gain without having to lose a lot of money, without having to invest a lot of resources, stuff like that.
I'd like to say something about this too. I know we've been kind of talking about how the government is contributing to what seems the most critical. And I'd kind of would like to disagree with what people have been saying. I think that the government begins and ends in places that are deemed more important. So like how you were talking about Hurricane Katrina, I had also done some looking into Hurricane Katrina, and nearly 15 years later, the places that were affected are still recovering. And I kind of compared it to the pipeline explosion in Bellingham, Washington in 1999. And within 4 years, that city was cleaned up. The place was good as new. And it's because the government contributes a certain percentage of their annual CI budget to places based on their population density, air traffic, and highway traffic. And so you have a place like Washington, who's much more highly populated in much more dense of an area than the Midwest, where Katrina hit. And so they had millions more dollars go to them trying to fix their infrastructure. And they had better infrastructure already because they were getting more of a budget. Whereas the Midwest and Katrina area, like you said, they were so unprepared and their entire economy was devastated. It's because they weren't getting the budget they needed from the government, because they weren't as important populace-wise. And so I think that's where private companies come in, is where the government doesn't see as being more important to develop infrastructure. It's helpful to have a private operation go in there because they're not as concerned about, how many people live there. They're more concerned about getting paid. So if you can pay a private company less money than it would take for the government to develop infrastructure, then it'd be more beneficial to the entire area.
But it seems like
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like that would be true, though, only if there are enough people to make the payments. So whenever I think about something like, I guess coming back to an argument that Zach had made a little bit earlier, think about the internet. Would we consider the internet to be a critical infrastructure? And would it make sense to run high-speed internet to Greensburg, Kentucky? Would there be enough people in Greensburg to pay for high-quality internet, as opposed to someplace like a Louisville, where certainly there are enough people in Louisville to pay to have a high-speed internet run? What do you guys think? Do you think that we should consider the internet to be a utility? Should it be part of the critical infrastructure system? Or is it really just kind of a luxury that isn't really part of critical infrastructure?
I think it should definitely be considered critical infrastructure because of how dependent we are on it today, because a lot of schools and hospitals, they definitely do depend on the internet to function. Although, like, if we were talking about this like 20 years ago, or maybe just 10 years ago, a lot of people probably wouldn't consider the internet critical infrastructure. Now, whether or not it would be beneficial to like run, high-speed internet to Greensburg, like, I don't know, because like I've never been there, but yeah, I definitely would consider it to be critical these days.
I would disagree. 30 years ago, we lived without the internet for the past 200 years. And while things were in a more primitive state, we definitely still operated. We still sent people to the moon without everyone having access to the internet. So I don't think that the internet as we're using it right now would be critical infrastructure, but I think like information technology, like NASA uses, like the government uses, those would probably be a lot more critical than just the general public having access to the internet.
I
Go ahead, Zach.
I agree and disagree with Carly. I think that I agree with the whole IT because it's like I said, like she said, it's incredibly important. But you're not going to have access to the IT without access to the internet. If you're, trying to get into it, or if you're not already within a private system within their company to like be able to access the information from a building, two buildings away, the same building. But also, through the internet, the access comes through for the ability through the internet, comes through. You have the example of cyber attacks and different potentials, like I mentioned earlier, about the prevalentness of those. The cyber attacks can happen just to private sector, happen to everybody. Your information can be stolen, people's credit cards, lives, finances are a part of critical infrastructure, banking. So like protection on that sense for all the things we do. Maybe some people just go on Google and ask stupid questions. Maybe some people literally do governmental work on it. Maybe some people try to manage electrical grid, 10,000 miles away. Like I think it's pretty important that the internet be accessible everywhere you be and be accessible in general, because it is, especially now, since 30 years ago we didn't use the internet for everything, but now you can go into just about any building, and there's rarely any buildings, especially in like a city or a largely funded state, that don't use the internet in some capacity to promote their business, to promote their welfare, to promote, especially hospitals use the internet as well. You have to access your records. We just had a cyber attack on hospital earlier this year that shut it down for like 2 months on that kind of stuff. So I think it's important. It interconnects all the critical infrastructure that you can do at, it connects it all more than it does. So I think it should be considered a critical infrastructure.
Yeah, to go off what Zach said, I definitely agree. I think the internet is critical infrastructure, but it's because I'll be fast, I promise, guys. I know everybody has somewhere to be. I just think that critical infrastructure, going back to the definition, I think that if you think about how detrimental not having the internet would be, rather than thinking about it if you could function without it, you need to think about the effects that it would have if we didn't have it. Not so much if we could overcome them, because it's not that we couldn't overcome them, because we could overcome dangers to national security. It's just dependent on whether or not how big the effect would be. Not having the internet does have its effects, considering that much of newer generations, especially my generation, I haven't done anything without the internet. Really grew up with the internet. So not having it would definitely be detrimental. But it's just, it depends on how you look at it, I guess, who you're asking. Baby boomers wouldn't necessarily say that the internet is critical infrastructure, but I think that anything cyber, especially IT, as Carly and Zach were arguing, is important.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to, I think, leave it there with the discussion on the internet. We're just about out of time. Thank you, everybody who has joined us either live or who catches this at some point in the future. And if you are interested, we are in our 9th out of 10 sessions for this semester. We do take off next Thursday for Thanksgiving, but we will be back for our final session, which we're going to be talking about the healthcare systems that are provided by the Nordic countries and whether or not similar systems would work well here in the United States. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us. Goodbye and God bless.